So, Dr. Marletto, one of the things that I love in speaking with scientists like yourself is their love and wonder for the natural world. And I think that's actually something that theists and scientists have in common. When I explore the work of both, I feel like there's a certain awe and a certain wonder that they have, and which I thoroughly appreciate. So I wanted to ask you about that specifically, but in order to do it, I want to frame it in a certain way, which is a long time ago. I had the pleasure of going to Florence and visited all the famous places, and I got to see Michelangelo's famous David sculpture, and which of course is magnificent and impressive. And it occurred to me that there are two ways of looking at that statue or any statue. One is to observe the structure, the form, the materials, and to find that aspect of it beautiful. You could even go down in a quantum level and appreciate that about it. And another one is to sort of step back and to try to discern the intent of the sculptor. Like what does this mean? Or why did he make it? And what I'm interested in with you is, could you explain what your underlying deepest motivation to do physics is? Like what is it that you love about it in the context of that example I gave?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think what I like in physics is the process through which we achieve deeper explanations by solving problems in our understanding of physical reality. So I guess the specific thing that I find fascinating is that when you look at things in the world, you can notice like a first layer, which is what you see superficially, and then you can start thinking, wait, why is it that I see this? Is there any deeper explanation? And then you can go a bit deeper and answer that question. So, for example, with another example, you can say, well, I see the dark sky at night with all of these stars, with all these bright objects. Why are they there, and what does that mean? And yes, with physics, you can start to, that's the start of a story, because you can then try to explain that in terms of deeper entities. And then those entities also could be decomposed in deeper entities and so on. And so in the way I think about physics is that it's really like a never-ending quest for deeper layers of understanding. And this is fascinating because it's like going on a ladder towards infinity in some sense. And this is really very exciting to me. And I think physics maybe more than other sciences has this aspect because we have it's really going at the deepest level of explanation as far as the fabric of reality is concerned. So in that sense, it has this unifying kind of trait. It's trying to explain things that look very different from each other, but actually they can be explained in terms of the same underlying concepts. And that's another aspect of physics that I really enjoy. So the fact that we can come up with unifying explanations.
Yes.
And so, yeah,
electricity,
I guess,
magnetism, that kind of thing.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, I think so. So, if, I think, for example, Newton's laws are an example that you can also kind of think of. They were the first, I think, properly universal explanation. And, they can explain the motion of objects on the Earth, and then the Earth's motion itself, and then other things, even in the cosmos. And it's kind of very exciting that this can be done. And this is what, I guess, really attracts me to physics. And in regard to your specific example, I think maybe this is from the point of view of the sculpture. You can, as you said, you can maybe relate different aspects of its beauty through underlying symmetries or geometrical regularities and so on. And these are all part of the explanation for why we find it beautiful. And in a way, that's maybe what excites me about in the analogy, just looking at reality through the lens of physics.
So you mentioned Newton, and in in researching your work, I did read your book, which, by the way, I'm going to recommend, The Science of Can and Can't. This is an amazing read. I love the way you insert those vignettes in between the chapters.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you about those, but I'm not going to ask now, but maybe later. But it makes it so readable and so entertaining, and so it's a fantastic job you did with that. So thank you. But in a video that I saw on YouTube, you said that we can never know if the law that we have is the right one, in referring to the laws of physics. And you just described that as exciting. I wonder also if you ever find it to be frustrating. Do you ever wake up and just say, since we're never going to know this anyway, why even bother looking? Does it ever just seem like this is just a dead end? And why are we doing this?
Yeah, I think that's maybe goes at the heart of one of these perhaps slightly contradictory aspects that you have in scientists, and I think maybe in physicists more specifically, and in myself. So on the one hand, we have this idea that there is a way to explain various phenomena that we see around us through some general laws, and if you like, this is a kind of assumption that we have, which is maybe supports all of our enterprise, and the fact that we're even looking for these laws. Mm-hmm. And then on the other hand, we know that once we stumble upon one law that seems to work, it may at some point stop working, in the sense that we may find it problematic or deficient. And I think this has happened time and again in the history of physics. And that always has led to some deeper understanding, because whenever a problem came up, we thought about it more carefully, and then we found a better way of kind of solving the problem, and then also expanding on the understanding that we had. Now, this is by no means guaranteed. And on the one hand, maybe you say one way of looking at it is to say it's frustrating, but the way I look at it is to say that is quite liberating or exciting, because it suggests that the more quickly you can find these problems or inconsistencies in the way you think about the universe, the more likely you are to make some progress or to understand things better. And so in that sense, it's nice that we can expect our laws at some point to fail or to be changed and improved, because there is room for improvement. So I kind of like to think of that aspect in terms of a kind of positive, open door towards further understanding. And if you like it, this is an assumption that we make. And it's an underlying assumption of our enterprises as physicists or scientists.
Okay, good answer. In the book, you talk about religion, and by the way, however you feel about it, is totally fine, and I'm not going to be insulted. In this forum, we try to have a very open conversation, and as our motto is striving together for integrity and meaning in the modern world. Okay, so so you talk about the concept. It's a philosophical concept of sometimes it's called turtles all the way down. Mm-hmm. And it's the idea that every cause has a cause that precedes it. And in this, if you envisioned the universe standing on the back of a great turtle, the question is what holds up that turtle? And the answer, of course, is another turtle. And then you have a problem because you have turtles all the way down, right? Which is, also known as the problem of the infinite regress. And I just want to read you a quote from the book, and then with your permission to challenge somewhat something that you say. I just want to see how you react to it. Don't take it personally. You say, how does one explain the existence of God in the first place without assuming another God who created him? In religion, the question is left unanswered. I know that that's a common belief. And I wanted to just quickly read, and we could get into the weeds here very quickly, I realize. So I'm going to try to keep it sort of like, 30,000 feet if possible. But there is something called the Kalam cosmological argument, which is very straightforward, which goes like this. It's got three premises. One is that that which begins to exist has a cause of its existence. Two, the universe began to exist. And three, therefore, the universe has a cause of its existence. This is about 1,000 years old. This first developed by Aristotle more than 1,000 years ago, but then by thinkers later on. And so, and one last quote. I know this is a very long question, but this is from the professor of philosophy, Ed Feser, who I'm a fan of. So he said, "So to ask what caused God, far from being the devastating retort new atheist writers suppose it to be, is in fact painfully inept." He doesn't mean you. When interpreted in light of the various arguments actually mean by cause and God, it really amounts to asking what caused the thing that in principle cannot have had a cause. So that's a lot. But with all that, how do you relate to the idea that maybe it's not that God has to have a cause, or that maybe it has to be that there can't be an infinite regress of causes, and as such there has to be like a final cause that caused all the causes?
Yeah, so I think the point that I want to zoom in a little bit on is this idea of a cause. So when we talk about explaining something, at least in physics, we want to have a way of decomposing this something into more primitive, more elementary entities, which ultimately are just somehow given by the laws of physics. So in that sense, we start with the assumption that there is something that is elementary in the universe, and these are, say, particles, interactions, and so on. And the game is to try to explain things that we see in terms of those. They are not necessarily causing things that we see. So the idea of a cause is a different one. So it's not necessarily that these things that we are using to explain things are causes of those things. But they are explanatory of those things. And if you like, you can also find more ways of decomposing these entities that we call primitive into further, more elementary, more primitive things.
Yes.
And what I was questioning in that passage is something that seems to me, in a way, is more or less underlying all religions, which is that when we kind of arrive to this idea of God, that idea is then not decomposable into further entities. And even if we thought that we wanted to do that by, say, some kind of, to solve some problems in our understanding,
Right.
that may not be acceptable within, say, a given religion. Now,
Yes.
I think if you interpret religion in a more liberal way or in a more general way, maybe this is not true. And there are ways of understanding God in more fundamental ways. And I'm happy to talk about that too. But I think, in a sense, I was targeting this idea to have an entity which appears, let's say, as complex and as grand as the things that you want to explain, which
Right.
you can't or don't want to explain further, which from the scientific point of view is difficult to accept. So that's I think what I was trying to challenge in that passage.
So I totally understand that. I guess I'm just wondering from a philosophical perspective,
Yes.
and it seems to me, please correct me if you disagree, that science often sort of terminates in philosophy, that there's the information, and then there's what we make of the information, and I do find it, at least in my casual reading of the scientific popular literature, that there is a certain amount of philosophizing that seems to accompany the scientific information.
Yeah.
If just the information was presented, most people couldn't read it anyway and would be lost. So the way I understand it is that most people agree scientists, I think, also, and philosophers, that there can't be an infinite regress. It's called the problem of the infinite regress, which means that it seems to mean to me that you can't trace back either in time or in cause, forever, events that are taking place, and therefore at the very, very end of it has to be, and like what Aristotle called the unmoved mover, the uncaused cause, the final backstop of the entire process. Is that not a logical, direction to go in?
I think this is, it's very nice you're asking this, because I think part of my work, and also what I say in the book, tries to challenge this view a little bit. And I have to say that even in physics, as you say, there is I think it's implicit in the idea of a law of motion, so something that describes the motion of objects, ultimately of the universe in space and time. There is some kind of idea that we need to define the initial conditions of this motion. And of course,
Right.
we then have to postulate those conditions. And those are like the unmoved mover, if you like. They are a relic of the unmoved mover. Unless we have then a way of explaining those initial conditions in terms of more elementary things, which can't be further initial conditions. Otherwise, we are in this trap of the infinite regress.
Right.
So I think the way in which we currently approach traditional physics and the most fundamental physics, which is the physics of elementary interactions and ultimately laws of motion of particles and the initial conditions, has, I think, this problem of, and this is what I also say in that chapter, of having to postulate some initial or final conditions for the motion of the universe. Right. And then if you don't further provide an explanation for those initial conditions, then you are somehow you're in the same philosophical problem
position
that you find by following some other explanations, such as religious ones, even though, of course, the content of the initial conditions is, of course, different from postulating the existence of God and so on. And what I'm trying to say is that, on the other hand, you can think of, rather than tracing back further and further back, more and more causes for whatever you see right now in the universe, it seems to me is more fruitful to try to go deeper in the level of explanations. So, for example, you could try to find deeper principles that are not based on law of motions and they're timeless, for example, which can explain the emergence of motion as we see it, as well as of kind of the initial conditions of these motions. And in that way, you're going, instead of going backwards, you're going like downwards in this kind of hierarchy of explanations.
Right.
And the important thing is that you would like the higher levels of the explanation to rely on simpler levels, so that you don't end up with this tower of turtles all the way down.
Right.
And I think this is I think other philosophers made these points in their own philosophies. What I'm trying to say is that I think in physics there is space for this kind of logic as well. And this would allow you to exit this problem that I think is there. And so I agree with you that there is a kind of maybe philosophical tension, even in the laws of physics, if we want to avoid this infinite regress problem.
So, I know that this is a huge topic, and there's books written on it, and we could probably talk about this for the rest of the time. I do think for me, it's exciting personally that physics, theology, and philosophy all sort of pointing in the same basic direction, and everyone in agreement that simplicity and more primal causes, is the direction to go in. Whether or not there's disagreement about what that ultimate cause is, I certainly understand, but I like the fact that at least we're all paddling in the same direction. So here's another question about information, which you talk about in the book, and I also found fascinating. We talk about the possibility of transferring a medium, for instance, from a vinyl record to CD to MP3. So sort of like the information is preserved across these different media. And that, of course, not of course, but that got me thinking, is a human being the same thing? Given, I know this is a biological question, but given the fact that all of our cells, from what I understand, replicate every 7 or so years, is some kind of information being transferred in media within a human being in a way that's significant? What exactly is being preserved? And, are these two ideas parallel, or do you see differences between them?
And no, I think this is kind of generally speaking, I think it's exactly the same. And the question that we haven't answered yet in physics and science more generally, I think, is the question of that you just asked. So what is it that we have to preserve in order to maintain this particular human being, if we were to change all of its all of the atoms that constitute the body of this person? For example, could we find, I mean, in principle, I think the laws of physics suggest that you could find a different support for a human being, when, say, a body becomes faulty and problematic in various ways. In principle, you could reproduce the relevant configuration of atoms of the brain and whatever else is needed into a different support. And then, of course, you can ask, as you said, when would you then have the same person once you operate this transformation? And it's definitely a transformation that involves information, because it's about copying things. But I think we don't have yet the answers to these kind of questions. But they are, in a way, I find them very hopeful, because each human being is an entity that contains a lot of knowledge, a lot of opinions, ideas, and feelings, and so on. And it would be wonderful to be able to preserve these things for let's say, much longer than we currently can.
Yes.
So yeah, I think that would be a very interesting problem to study in science, and we should do more in that direction. Yeah.
Okay. What would you call the entity that was being transferred? Would you call it information? Would you call it consciousness? Do you believe that consciousness is transferable? Like, are you saying in theory it could be uploaded to a computer at some point in the future? Do you think that would still be the same person? I know these are huge. Each one of these is a huge topic within within science.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, this is very speculative. So in a way, these are more like my opinions, and they're based on hunches, in a sense. But they're also based on some underlying ideas that we have from physics and the understanding of information that we've achieved. So I think that we don't have any reason in physics to expect that this information that constitutes the collection of opinions and thoughts that make a person who they are can't be moved from a physical support to a different physical support. And now this is it's just what I'm saying is that we don't know of any law that says this is impossible. We don't know how to do it. But we don't have a principle like the conservation of energy or the conservation of something else that says we can't do that. And this also goes together with the fact that so this suggests there are parts of the body of a person that are not really integral to that person, so they are just accidental things. And so if you were to move it to a different embodiment, the person would still be there, would still have the same, personality and the same thoughts and creativity and reactions to various things. And I also don't know if we really have a good terminology for this. I think that's a good question, what you're asking, because it's not just consciousness, and it's not just information, because information is too broad a term. It also includes the ability of a given brain or a person to come up with new thoughts, the creativity of this person, and so on. And so actually, I don't think in science we really have a measure even for this thing, right? So we don't know how to, so we know how it works, in some sense. We have an idea of neuroscience, so we have lots of kind of better understanding of how the brain works. But it's difficult to connect this more microscopic understanding of the mechanism within the brain with this high level description that I'm now giving of, what is it that makes a person, that particular person, and not a different one. So
can I ask you a follow-up on that?
Yeah.
I was aware, in reading in your book, I either think you dedicated it to your father or you mentioned him, and I could tell that was an important, significant part of your life. You do. I think you reference your childhood a few times in the book as well, in which I got the impression that it was a very happy one.
Yes, it
and,
was.
Yeah. And which is great. I wonder, and as somebody who who has lost a parent as well in the last few years, do you, as a scientist, approach a situation like that? Like, I have my own, theological, spiritual feelings about those events. Is there a part of you that says, well, I don't know, the laws of physics don't seem to allow for, any continuation of this presence that I once had, or do you say, maybe someday there will be the possibility of coming back into contact with whatever consciousness that was, and whatever a consciousness is, or do you have to resign yourself to the absolute loss, or do you have hope as a scientist that it's not over?
I think that, so my understanding of physics, suggests that this is a very unlikely thing to occur. In a way, I would say it's impossible. And so in a sense, it's, so even though, as you said, there is a sense in which physics could allow for various things to be done to a person when they're approaching the end of their life, so that they could be transferred into a different, embodiment, and then continue actually to exist. I think once death occurs, is very difficult, at least from the point of view of a scientist, to expect that this presence, that the person that actually was embodied in this entity after death is can be retrieved in some way. And this is because we have this understanding of consciousness and the brain and so on, that's materialistic. So it's based on the fact that this is all ultimately stored in atoms, and etc. And when death occurs, this information that was in the brain that made up the person just evaporates in a sense that is not preserved anymore. So in that sense, I think it's an irreversible loss, and there are other things one can think of in order to make sense of that. But yeah, it's definitely it's just a loss of knowledge. You can think death is one of the main ways in which knowledge gets lost, and it's a very negative occurrence of that happens. And it would be nice to be able to modify the fact that it inevitably happens in the way that it does, or at least delay it, or do a number of things that could preserve this knowledge that resides in each person.
For what it's worth, and this will be the last thing I'll ask you about this for now, but I had the pleasure of speaking to Professor Donald Hoffman a few weeks ago, and his research informs him. He feels that the true nature of ultimate reality is not based in space-time, but rather the fundamental is consciousness. And at least there's one scientist out there, if not more, who holds that the preservation of consciousness does survive the death of the body. And for whatever that's worth, his book is fascinating too. And I know you guys are in different disciplines, but just wanted to put it out there as a hopeful thing. Okay. I have another question about, let's talk about, I have many, actually, as I told you, I have many questions for you, but I'm going to try to limit it. You talk about dogma in your book, and you say you have a set of truths which are just there and they can't be criticized, but that's not science. If you want to do physics, you have to test your theories against experiments. As soon as you stick to a dogma, then you are not free of making criticisms about it. You're not allowed by the rules of dogmatism to change the dogmas and incorporate a new statement about it. So what I wanted to ask is there any branch of science, in which there is something like a dogma? Is everything testable? Are certain things just simply accepted as axiomatic? Is there any parallelism between what you would perceive as a religious dogma and a scientific one?
I think not, but I have to maybe explain a bit better what I mean by that. So science has assumptions. And as I said earlier, there are a number of things that we assume, and then we try to see what happens once we assume those things, what are the implications and so on. And there are then some theories that actually become so well corroborated and part of our understanding that it becomes somewhat more unlikely to actually challenge them, and so it becomes more difficult to, if you see something's going wrong in an experiment, you may not question as your first thing the conservation of energy, but you might question some other things. For example, not having plugged in a certain detector, and as a result of that, you're seeing some deviations from what you expect. However, what I was trying to say in that passage is that there is a thing that we can always do in science, which is that we can question these assumptions. So we have them, but we are free to question them and to seek for ways of actually making them problematic. So I think we have these tools like thought experiments that we are trying to go along with, kind of to try to see whether some of these assumptions are actually contradictory, or they are leading us astray in some way, if they are tested within a certain domain that we usually don't think about. So this is a kind of thought experiment kind of situation that we can use. And I think this is different from what happens with the real dogma, which is one that, if you take it literally, is a statement that can never be questioned and modified. And I think perhaps you can find this in some the basis of some totalitarian regimes, if you like. There are some kind of assumptions tenets that they assume and never want to kind of put into question. And you can also find that in maybe everyday lives. Sometimes you have some implicit or inexplicit or explicit assumptions about reality that don't allow you to make progress because you don't want to question them. That also counts as a kind of, broadly speaking, as a dogma. And my view is that somehow these dogmas intended in this way are not they don't appear in science, because in science we are allowed, actually it's part of the game, to question these assumptions that we're starting from. And that's interesting, because when you test them, you question them, you find better explanations, and that's part of the whole process of trying to understand better what's going on in a given situation.
I totally hear that, and I think that religion has a lot to learn from science, in that regard. And I wonder if in certain ways they're not learning it, And I'm just thinking back to, I don't know, but I know a lot of Italy is Catholic, and in in considering an important dogmatic change that the Catholic Church made in the 60s, which was called Vatican II, which essentially, and the reason it's important to me is like they basically changed their minds, or like they absolved the Jews from responsibility for the death of Jesus, and then said Jews could also find salvation in their own way, and so it was such a radical departure from many centuries of a view that it struck me as a very open-minded and hopeful kind of reevaluation of a tenet of the faith. And I'm just pointing that out to say that maybe it's not as absolute as it often seems to people. And then also just to say that at least in the Jewish tradition, there's a real emphasis placed on questioning, the entire Talmud is just replete with attacks and counter arguments, and every assumption under the sun is questioned. And I think that tradition of questioning sometimes can be compromised, and I think the cultures can reach certain impasses in time where they become more closed. But I think at least I'm in full agreement with you, and I hope with the scientific community, that the question itself, a question is the most valuable tool that we have to understand our reality. So I haven't really asked you a question in this case.
No, I agree. I think the traditional criticism, especially in the Jewish tradition, and I know it from friends who kind of told me about this, is one thing that I really like a lot. And I think it's certainly maybe a point where the way science proceeds and the way some religions proceed, or some people within some religion proceed, can find a kind of a point of contact or closeness, and it's very important. I think it's also a way of understanding. I'm thinking now from the point of view of a religious person. Even the history of religions, you can find some of these very deep writings where it was exactly questioning the meaning of the logos, right, of the word, that led to deeper understanding of it. And so, in that sense, I think that was trying to by trying to seek a deeper understanding, was doing exactly this process of conjecture and criticism, which is like the basis of science too. So in that sense, I can see that there is a nice connection there, and yeah, I think it should be fostered more. Maybe
Okay, so I have my work cut out for me, but I'm glad that you see that the possibility exists. That means something to me, and it looks like I have time for 2 more questions, and I'm trying to select carefully the best ones. Let's talk about morality for a second in the lens of science. So the quote that I like, I guess I'm going to say I like it, but it's a quote that interests me, from Jacques Monod, who is a biologist. And he says, it's perfectly true that science attacks values. If he accepts the message in its full significance, man must at last awake out of his millenary dream and discover his total solitude, his fundamental isolation. He must realize that, like a gypsy, he lives on the boundary of an alien world, a world that is deaf to his music and as indifferent to his hopes as it is to his sufferings or his crimes. And I know he's a Nobel Prize winner, and obviously he's very accomplished in what he does, but do you view the scientific analysis as causing this net result, of undercutting the legs of morality entirely, in this dramatic way that he says?
No, not at all. And I think so. I think there is. I know that there is tradition in science that might kind of maybe think along similar lines, but I don't belong to that. And the reason is that I think of knowledge. So I think of science as kind of one way of explaining, the world. But also there are other kinds of knowledge that we can create, and by thinking. And I think ethics and morality are kinds of knowledge that we are able to create in different situations. And in that context, I think it's completely compatible with the scientific view that the universe is, that you don't need God inside, in explanations that are part of science and so on. So this view is consistent with the idea that you can consider moral problems as problems that can be solved by the usual method of conjecturing solutions and criticizing them and so on. And that when you find a theory of morality that appears better than others, like what you do also in other areas of philosophy, you're actually creating new knowledge. And it seems to me this process of trying tentatively to find better theories of morality, which we've tried to do in the history of humanity, isn't at all undermined by the understanding of the world that science provides us with. And you can think of human beings as being part of the laws of physics. We are obeying. We're kind of made of things that obey the laws of physics. But our brains produce theories, and these theories are part of the reason why we act in one way or another. And in certain situations, you can say that certain thing is morally bad or morally good, and then you have a theory about what that means, and then criticize that theory. And it seems to me that it's not in contradiction to have a discussion about those moral values with the fact that you maintain that the world is made of atoms and they obey certain laws and so on. So I think they are, morality pertains to a different level of explanation than fundamental science. But broadly speaking, I see the way in which we proceed in these fields as similar, in the sense that it's also about conjecturing new ideas and criticizing existing ones and trying to make progress in a kind of tentative way. And I don't think it's at all undermined by the fact that science tells us some things about, what the natural world is like.
Okay, good. I'm on the same page. And my last question for today it's another quote. And we're going back to considering, the ultimate nature of physical reality. This one's from John Archibald Wheeler. And he wrote once, he says that it's not unreasonable to imagine that information, which we've already spoken about, sits at the core of physics, just as it sits at the core of a computer. And he says it from bit symbolizes the idea that every item of the physical world has at its bottom, a very deep bottom in most instances, an immaterial source and explanation. So you think so? Is really ultimate reality immaterial? Or does he have this wrong? And no, really, we are dealing with the physical world in the truest sense of the word, and that's really the way things are.
Well, I very much like that quote, and I think Wheeler's work is very dear to me in many ways, very interesting, and Wheeler was my mentor's mentor in a sense. So David Deutsch is one of Wheeler's students, and he was my mentor, and I think I can see in David's works a lot of that in some sense. And one thing I like about this idea is that whether or not you want to say that bit is the fundamental thing in physical reality, one interesting point there is to say that explanations, things that we create with our brain, are part of physical reality, and they have some power over reality as well. So in a sense, when we come up with a new idea, this idea may have an impact on various things in the physical world. Just for example, humans discovered some laws of physics, and then as a result of that, we managed to modify various aspects of the atmosphere around the Earth, maybe that wasn't a very good outcome of that. But you know, we are modifying various aspects of the physical reality. And if you think about what is it that's causing that, in the good ways and in the bad ways, is ultimately a bunch of ideas that we created. And that is a very interesting thing. It's because these ideas are made of information, kind of information which we can call knowledge, if you like. And I know that I mean, this idea is something that David is very fond of, and I myself like very much. And the kind of stuff that physics currently studies, which is mostly, you know, if you like, in the traditional way of thinking about physics, you're mostly talking about ultimately elementary particles and interactions, are at one level of explanation. But then there are these other things, information-like entities, which do exist. They are part of physics. They are compatible with the underlying level of explanation in terms of elementary particles, but they themselves have their own laws. And it's interesting to find out those laws. And I think that's an interesting thing for physics to do. I'm kind of hoping that, you know, part of my research can help with that, let's say.
I'm sure it will. And I wanted to take this moment and thank you so much for being here and having this conversation with me. It was incredibly edifying. I want to plug your book one more time, The Science of Can and Can't. This is a magnificent work, which I recommend everybody go out and get.
Thank you very much.
It's my great pleasure. Thank you for your time. And for the audience out there, please take a moment to subscribe to our YouTube channel and to stay abreast of all the great offerings that we have coming up. And there are a whole bunch of them that I'm very excited about. So join us again, subscribe, like, comment. Thank you so much for being here.